So to start this afternoon session, let's repeat the 16 lines from the handout. How we're going to anchor our weekend program on these 16 lines. Shravakas and intermediate Buddhas are born from the mighty sages, and the fully awakened Buddhas are born from the Bodhisattvas. A compassionate mind, understanding of non-duality, and bodhicitta, these are the causes of the victor's heirs. Love is the seed of this abundant harvest of Buddhahood. It is like the water which causes growth and expansion, and it ripens into the state of lasting enjoyment. Therefore, at the outset, I shall praise compassion. Firstly, with the thought of I, they cling to self, and then with mind, they grow attached to things. Helplessly, they wander like a turning water wheel. To compassion for these beings, I bow down. Beings are like the moon in rippling water, fitful, fleeting, empty in their nature. Bodhisattvas see them thus and yearn to set them free. Their minds come under the power of compassion. So this morning, we basically looked at the first 4 lines, and then we started to look at the next 4 lines, which is these 4 lines on love is the seed of this abundant harvest of Buddhahood. It is like the water which causes growth and expansion, and it ripens into the state of lasting enjoyment. Therefore, at the outset, I shall praise compassion. So I pointed out how probably in this case, for Candakirti, the author of this text, he seems to be using the word love and the word compassion as synonymous or interchangeable. And so from one perspective, you could see that that's what he's doing. As we were coming back from lunch, there was a big billboard right before here that says, love heals, and then it's the house of compassion. So they too equated and using these 2 words as somewhat synonymous. But we also know from other contexts that these 2 are often used in very specific kind of different ways as well. And so especially in the context of the 4 Brahma dwellings in the Theravada tradition, or what's called the 4 immeasurables in the Mahayana traditions. Then you have the 4 qualities of metta, love, or kindness, or goodwill. Then karuna, compassion. Then mudita, joy. And then upeksha, equanimity. So there it's clearly delineated as 4 different qualities, 4 different heart qualities, 4 different states of mind. So, so of course, you know, if you treat the second verse where love seems to be used as interchangeable with compassion, then, you know, you can say love hyphen compassion is the seed of this abundant harvest of Buddhahood. So it's at the cause level, it's love and compassion. At the level of, like you could say, it's growth, the path. It's like the water that causes it to grow and expand. and then as it ripens, as it becomes, as it bears fruit. What is the fruit? The fruit is none other than love and compassion. Now, of course, from another perspective, one might say that the fruit of Buddhahood is freedom from confusion, and therefore, kind of to be technical, you would say that it's wisdom, right? The wisdom that finally has dispelled the confusion. Sure, nothing wrong with that. Pretty standard, in fact. But again, if we want to take quite literally what Chandrakirti is saying here, then we can see that he's also emphasizing that the real fruit is not wisdom itself. Okay? Because if it is wisdom itself and just that, then it's not really a fruit. In other words, we could say, well, what's the wisdom good for? Right? It has to be good for benefiting others. Method is said to be compassion. But I think another perspective that we could think about is that actually, perhaps wisdom is the method. Right? Because by properly awakening wisdom or employing wisdom and let wisdom shine into the situation, then love and compassion can truly kind of burst forth for the benefit of others. So in a way here it's emphasizing, maybe you could say a more active aspect of what it means to be awake. Well, awake to do what? Oh, I'm wide awake now. And then what, right? Well, and then it has to be, the effect of that has to be impactful on this side of confusion. At least from where we are standing. Buddha's wisdom, from where we are standing at least, right? Buddha's wisdom is kind of beside the point. If Buddha's compassion isn't, right, at work. Then you could say from on that other side, then all these terminology, categories, are kind of irrelevant. But it's important, I think, that we pay more attention to on this side of confusion. In other words, on relative truth. I think there's a tendency to, because you hear the word ultimate. Well, it's ultimate, right? Shouldn't that be the ultimate? Right? So then we want to go in the direction of ultimate. But actually, the issue of suffering and happiness is irrelevant on the ultimate side. The issue of happiness and suffering is a relative problem. So, in some ways, there's not much point or use in dwelling that much on the ultimate. Because the ultimate is the ultimate. It will take care of itself. And when you are there, so to say, when you actualize that, then everything's fine. It's the relative side of things that we need to figure out how to handle. Right? And so that, I think, has implications on all sorts of things. I think in terms of our personal practice, the way we are in the world, how to be in the world, how to move around in the world, always remember that no matter whatever profound view, profound wisdom that we could talk about, think about, practice, focus on, if on the relative level suffering is not reducing, happiness is not increasing, then we might not be going about this the right way. Or even worse sometimes. Oh, the ultimate. And then you ignore what needs attention on the relative. So that is a form of, in Buddhist context, we say a form of like nihilism. To veer off in the direction of talking about the ultimate, when actually the ultimate doesn't need that much talk. In that sense, my appreciation of those Buddhist traditions, in my opinion, for example, in the Theravada tradition, there's very little talk about ultimate. Because it's the ineffable. And even Mahayana traditions agree it's ineffable. Well, if it is ineffable, then stop talking about it already. And stop obsessing about it already. Yeah? What's so powerful, what's so useful about the Buddha's teachings to us is not the teachings about the ultimate. It is the teachings about, on the relative level, what are we going to do? Or not do? Then the ultimate will take care of itself. If you go about it the other way, then you might objectify the ultimate. Then it's not the ultimate. Yeah? It's a facsimile of it. A facsimile that maybe in the short term you kind of walk around wearing it like it's a protective amulet. It might have some temporary, pacifying result, but it doesn't remove the existential problem, so to say, that we have. And so, having said that, now we look at the ultimate. The third line, right? A compassionate mind and understanding of non-duality. So, what is this non-duality to understand? This is in some ways a ultimate level talk. And so we should say just enough. They say you should eat to only about 80% of your fill. And then that's good. But that's very un-American. It's not patriotic to behave like that. You should eat to 120% and show that you are grateful for. So here, these three elements are said to be what produces, what causes bodhisattvas to arise. So there, so how do we go from the state of confused beings to being bodhisattvas? Then these are the three things. So first, compassionate mind, which we will be looking at a lot more for the rest of this time here. But now, a little bit about understanding of non-duality. So here it says, we need to understand. We need to kind of know what duality is, and then what non-duality is. The duality that we're talking about here is basically the duality of self and other. The bifurcation into self and other. I think without needing to go into, is there only one? And therefore, self and other is false. I think those kinds of questions, like is there only one? Or the ultimate is only one? Those are metaphysical questions. Right? Yeah. They're like, big, like ontological, the ground of being kind of question. which my understanding of Buddhist teachings is fundamentally Buddha wasn't interested in those questions. Those are abstracts. Now, it doesn't mean Buddhists didn't spend a lot of time teasing out all those things in the last 2,500 years. And one could surely go spend a lot of time studying that. But I think Buddha was much more interested in the lived experience. So then, on this level, what is duality? So duality is the separation, the bifurcation between self and other. Now, without needing to commit to some sort of bigger statement that ultimately there's only one, or ultimately there's nothing, or ultimately da-da-da, right? Again, leave ultimate out of the picture. The problem of duality here is actually related to further down, the third verse. Firstly, with the thought of I, they cling to self, and then with mine. So I and mine. There is already a very basic level of duality. Once you have a notion of I, that turns up, then the next thing, the immediate thing might not even, the immediate thing is mine. Mine, and then there's not mine. But mine is basically then, you could say, a step further than other. Right? So once a sense of self arises, then not self, or that which is not self, or other arises. Right? Once self arises, then other arises. And these two actually can only exist like a card tent with two, like, playing cards resting on each other. You take one away, the other one collapses. It has no meaning. So here, an understanding of non-duality, you can say, is to have that understanding. That these are arbitrary. These are temporary, dependent notions. Self, I, not I. And then in relation to not I, what happens? Mine, not mine. Like, dislike. Want, don't want. And then from there. Yeah? And then from there. Attachment, aversion, desire, hatred. And the whole gamut all comes from there. You see how this is not, no need to sign on to the ultimate nature is 1, 1.5, 1 minus 1, leave that alone. See that here is primarily, so no need to talk about universal consciousness or universal self or universal Buddha, even whatever word you want, that's kind of like, yeah, if you have time and, the inclination, you can talk about that. But insofar as the primary reason why the Buddha taught the Dharma, let's take it on that level first. So here, an understanding of non-duality is, there are obviously more and more subtle and profound levels of that understanding. But here is saying, if we could just have that understanding, then we are on our way to being bodhisattvas. If we have a compassionate mind. So a compassionate mind needs to be combined with understanding. Understanding of the way things are. And more to the point, understanding of how suffering arises. So this is a more focused expansion of the second noble truth. The mechanics of suffering. The mechanics of entanglement. The mechanics of getting trapped. And once we see the mechanics of that, then we know how to end it. Now, of course, habits are very strong. Right? Just because you know how to end it doesn't mean you can end it immediately. So there's habit patterns to keep fighting back. Right? So, But at least, once we have understanding, I feel that once we have understanding, even if you can't beat the habit yet, and the suffering turns up, you're already in a fairly good position. At least I have felt like that myself. I cannot at all claim that, I have overcome any of my habits. But now, at least when these habits, start to conspire and then produce suffering, I have some understanding, so that I don't get wrapped up in the suffering as strongly as before. Still strong and painful, just less strong and painful than before, because there's understanding. Right? And the understanding that goes, well, yeah, what do you expect? How else could it be? So even if you cannot immediately fix it, just having an understanding, you stop beating yourself over it, or beating other people over it, and say, well, that's fundamentally, it's an uncontrollable choice that I've made that has created this situation. So uncontrollable, meaning as much as I don't want it now, I know I can't put an end to it. But then that's enough. You don't need to beat yourself over it. You don't need to blame yourself. You don't need to say, I'm a bad person. It's habit patterns now conspiring for this to happen. Yeah? And then don't feed it. Then you can get out of that particular mess sooner than not. So non-duality here is just, it is pointing to this, that once a sense of self has arisen, then without a choice, it almost simultaneously rises with other. And a sense of self is not stable, We tend to think that a sense of self is stable at all times, so that's what Buddha is saying, why it's inconstant, meaning stable. But we kind of like, without any reason really, we walk around kind of thinking that self is something stable. Self is something continuous. I mean, of course, on some level, we walk around with that because it gives us, a cohesiveness, a narrative that we can hang, all sorts of things on, and walk around feeling like, okay, I'm altogether enough. But often it becomes more than just, altogether enough. It becomes exaggerated very quickly. But nonetheless, the sense of self, again now here, right, Buddha talked about, taught not self. It says anatta or anatman, not self. I would say then it's maybe no need to say no self. That again gets into areas that are more theoretical, philosophical, or metaphysical. You come back to this as not self. And then treat this anatta, anatman, as a tool to see how, no, that is not self. No, that is not self. No, that is not self. And that also is not self. So it's a practice of not letting your sense of self arise in dependence on, by depending on shifting, changing, unreliable factors. Shifting, changing, unreliable factors. Because any kind of self that arises by relying on shifting, changing, unreliable factors will be a source of suffering, of disappointment, of frustration. But going back to the point of how a sense of self is not stable, it arises in different ways and intensity based on the situation. Sometimes you could kind of pass a whole day without any strong sense of self. But in a completely kind of mindless way. Sometimes you can spend a whole day without any sense of self, but in the sense of at least temporarily transcending the self. That is when you're absorbed in doing something that is so meaningful or so captivating that you also don't think of self anymore. The sense of self is not there. You're so kind of like at one, so to say, with all that is going on with everything, and no provocations of the heart. And that's the ideal kind of sense of self doesn't arise. But then throughout the day, this sense of self arises, ceases, sometimes very strong, sometimes weak in a kind of dull way, and sometimes weak kind of in a very invigorating way. And then you're free of the burdens of carrying around a self, an identity that you then have to define, that then you have to account for, and then you have to be consistent for, and so on and so forth. And then you have to go, but no, that's not me. I'm not normally like that. Well, it's happening now, normal or not, it's there. So don't identify. But this not identifying isn't done by desensitizing yourself, like shut down your five senses, and then you think, oh, I'm in a state of ease and peace. That's a temporary break from stress, but it's not a solution. So that's the non-duality, just a little bit here. And then the next bodhicitta is like, then on the basis of the wisdom and this understanding of how duality creates suffering, then you have the commitment, the desire, the aspiration to awake, to be Buddha. That's the meaning of Buddha, to awake for the benefit of others, for the good of all. So these three. Now, as I said this morning, the practice of love, or metta, or maitri. So what we translate as love is, of course, also has some limitations and some challenges. Love is a very powerful four-letter word in English. It's the most used and abused word, or at least in the top 10. So it carries a lot of connotations and baggage. Here, metta is said to be maybe more along the lines of a warmness, a friendliness, a sense of goodwill that we feel, that we feel, a sense of well-being, a wish of well-being for ourselves or for others, a friendliness, goodwill. And then I mentioned too, it's a definition of to have happiness and the causes of happiness. To be happy and to be the causes, and to also have the causes of happiness. Then, in one of the discourses that the Buddha gave, this is found in the Pali Canon, in the Karaniya Metta, it says, Just as a mother would protect her only child, that feeling that a mother has for her only child. Likewise, we should have that feeling. We should develop that feeling towards all beings. So Buddha then, gave an example, or at least a basis for us to work with when we want to work with, when we want to cultivate metta. So the care that a mother has for her only child, and more specifically, that wish of well-being that she has for her child. Always thinking of the welfare, of the well-being of the child. Now, this has nothing to say about, whether it comes with wisdom or not. So the example kind of stops there. We all know, that it's complicated, right? Relationship with our mothers. So the analogy doesn't take into account all the other complications. Right? It's only talking about how, on a certain level, right? It's a very present one. No matter how old the mother is, and how old the child is, there's always in the mind, the well-being of my child. Right? But the concern for the well-being of my child can get really neurotic, and then become very controlling, and so on and so forth. Okay, leave that out. Then the founder, he taught, he says, so if you want to kind of feel, like what does this feel like, this metta? Again, so what is the texture of this feeling? Right? So he gave this kind of mental exercise. He says, you think of how a mother, again mother, and then later he actually says, he said, we live in degenerate age, and so sometimes mothers don't evoke that feeling for some of us. Even in 12th century Tibet, so it's not only an American problem. He said, we live in a degenerate times, and so even with mothers, we have no choice. Not talking about us being degenerate, the times. So that mothers are also kind of complicated, and children are complicated, and all of that. But he says, try to imagine the feeling that a mother has. And here it's nuanced differently. Yeah? The quote from the Buddha says the mother wanting to protect, right? Here Jiten Sumgön is slightly different. He says, what is metta? He says, metta, you can best get at the feeling of metta if you can imagine the feeling that a mother has when she is observing her child happily playing. Whether playing with herself or playing with others. And for that, in fact, he says, well, even if you cannot imagine a mother, imagine you watching a child playing and being happy. And that feeling that arises, not the feeling of the child being happy, but the feeling that arises in you when you watch a child play. He says, that's what we're talking about here. Metta. Not the child of your enemy. Again, don't complicate this. Yeah, just a child. Maybe not even your own child. Then there's no attachment, right? so maybe the mother child is a little bit, trying to control, But just in a very neutral way, when you watch. So some friends said, a friend of mine said, I get it, but I don't really get it. To truthfully tell you, I think the same feeling that I get from what you described is when I watch puppies. I say, okay, And that warmth that just arises. And you wish the puppies or the child to continue to be safe and happy and protected. This is a beautiful way to help us understand what we're talking about when we say love here. What is this metta? Metta is that. Metta is that. So just thinking. Or now start taking time to go to a park where kids are playing. Just kind of pay attention. Pay attention to what the heart feels. And when you see that, when you watch that. And Judaism says, that's metta. That's metta. That's Champa, which is what Maitreya's name is. The root of that name is metta, the friendly one, which is said to be the future Buddha. It's the friendly, the one with goodwill, the one that wishes you well, unconditional, no agenda, harder for mothers. Sometimes.
I noticed you hang out with young children a lot.
Yeah.
There's something going on there.
No complications. No complications. No expectations. The child has no expectations. You have no expectations, because you're willing to give that generosity. Well, now when they get older, you start having expectations. You have to be this way. All of that enters the picture. But no expectations, no complications. It's a so in that way, maybe puppies or kittens work really well. You don't expect the puppy to, they're just puppies. You just kind of unconditionally kind of accept, and wish them well. So, little rabbits, chinchillas, ferrets. Yeah, so that unconditional wish for someone to be well, including yourself, to be well, to be protected, to be happy, that's metta. And so here it says we have to start with love. So then, before we took a break, I said, how about we consider that love and compassion is actually used separately here? How about we consider that? We can't go back to ask Chandrakirti. I have not figured out how to channel him. And so let's leave that alone and say, let's say, he wasn't using them together. And that was the point that I made, that before we can cultivate compassion, first we need to cultivate love, metta. Because compassion has to do with the removal of suffering. And when you cultivate that, then you have to get yourself close to suffering. Now, how do you get yourself close to suffering without being plagued by suffering? Without being kind of pushed down and come under the power of suffering. How? By and with the shield of metta. The shield of metta will prevent compassion exhaustion. Right? It's so exhausting these days. all the news can tell you all the terrible things that are happening in the world. And we get so depressed and down when we're watching that. Why? Because we don't have metta as a shield. Yes,
well,
please.
When you see a happy child, and you're the mother, you know that there's some work that's gone into that child being happy right at that moment. You know, it's had a nap, they've been fed, they feel safe, you know. So there's agency involved in the happiness. You know, it's not just like springing out of nowhere.
But here actually I mean, all of that of course is true.
Well, I'm asking if we need to be thinking of that in terms of ourselves too, though, in terms of like.
Oh, that's a second step.
Okay.
That's a different part of the training, actually.
Okay.
Here it's giving you this image to kind of.
Just the feeling.
Yeah, just to get the feeling to come up.
Just the wish.
Yeah,
that they
and then you then on that basis you start to extend this metta.
Okay.
And then that's when all of you know already, you know, right? To one that you care about, and then extend it to the one that you care about -1, and then you care about -2, and go further out until, you know, the neighbor that you're supposed to love, but it's so hard to love, you know, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. What you're talking about is somewhere else on the path, yeah, about karma, about all of that, yeah. So it's also very important, and I'm glad you asked this question. Like sometimes we in order to make connections, we kind of bring everything in and then we can't digest. But I think with this way of teaching, with methods, they all have very kind of, you know, this exercise is meant for this. This exercise is meant for this. And then this exercise is meant for this. You're strengthening this muscle here, you're strengthening that muscle there, you are training this muscle here, you're training that muscle there. Then it becomes doable, rather than immediately you have to think about so many other things, you know, which is all true, you know, yeah, what you said I totally agree. But in this case, for cultivating metta, no, it's just to bring up that feeling. Now, when you bring up that feeling, so you start with, okay, you think of a child playing. You try to recall the last time in a very clear way. You observe some children playing, you observe some puppies and kitten, and so then this feeling of warmth comes up. And that's your raw material. Now it needs an object. Then you bring someone in front. You imagine someone in front. That's something concrete. Maybe your own child who is suffering. Then you wish them happiness. Not focusing on their suffering, but just bring them in your presence. But that's like, yeah. But actually there are other steps that I want to share with you today before you get to very specifically finding people to kind of radiate your metta towards. So before we start radiating metta to others, right? First it says you need to have metta. If you don't have metta, if you yourself do not have a basis for metta, then you can't radiate metta.
If you want.
If you don't have the experience of metta yourself, you can't radiate metta. And so, like in the metta meditation, it says, may I be well and happy. Right? That formula, kind of you repeat, may I be well and happy. May I be well and happy. And you know, some people it works well. For me, it doesn't work. I feel like, you know, it's kind of mechanical. May I be all and happy. May I be all and happy. So for me, it works better with images that I bring. So starting with that image, as Maha said, as observed, I have a goddaughter that I'm really fond of course, play with, and so I can go to that image. So then I feel, okay, metta. Right? Then I know, oh, so that's the feeling of metta. But actually in the cultivation of metta, that's not quite yet, but you have to start somewhere. Right? So that tells you, okay, that's the feeling of metta. Rather than, the loving eyes that I have, at my, burrito. That's a different kind of love there, right? Right? So we want to clarify what love are you talking about, right? It's like the love for my burrito, that's a different love, And then substitute, right? The love that you have for, your spouse, the lover the fling that you have, like all these different kinds of love. So you want to make sure, what kind of love are we talking about here? Okay, so you have tapped that. Then here is where the formal practice actually starts. You now try to recall. So this is all about recollection. Yeah? So now you try to recall an instance of someone having that wish for you. The wish that you have for when you see a child playing, and you'll be safe. I want you to be safe. I want you to continue to be happy like that. I want you to be at ease. I want you to be well. Right? So now try to recall an instance where you recognize. Right? An easy instance when you recognize someone who has wished that for you. This someone need not be perfect and far from. So then you don't need to go look for, saintly figures. In all the complications of your mother or your father or your spouse, you leave the complications aside, but you remember those instances where you know that person has shown you unconditional goodwill. No strings attached. Not trying to get you to give them a job, not trying to manipulate you into, not grounding them. So you recall something like that. Then you feel, I have received metta. Then another instant. And bring these people into the space in front of you now. You could go, you're now doing metta auditing. Yeah. You take stock of all the instances of metta that someone else has wished upon you, has radiated towards you. And so they start to turn up in front, maybe not hovering, just seated, right? And they're all now looking at you with that same moment. All those moments, all bringing it into the present moment. Now, all the way back to kindergarten, all the way back to the grandparent and the cookies that you can smell walking into that door, and the care that grandma had. Feel that, and feel you have to accept love before you can radiate love. So first is an exercise in taking stock of all those individuals in your life, known and not known. including like remembering perhaps, you know, the postal guy, the person at the bank, for whatever reason, you know, was just beaming at Target. How are you? And just like in that moment, you know, that person just wants to make sure that you're well, you're good. So even very kind of pedestrian, or what we would normally just dismiss as pedestrian, or like, that's their job. Right? See, we have become so cynical. And we've become so afraid, so that whenever people show any kind of metta, we think there are strings attached, we think there's agenda. Well, maybe not. We don't actually know. But in the not knowing, what's better?
To assume the best.
Yeah. Maybe not when you're trying to buy a car. You know, so let's also be realistic. But now here, seated on this cushion, no need to be suspicious, because they're not right there trying to scam you. Right? Because this is about training our hearts first. So bring all of that into our presence. And feel, you know, this metta that is radiating towards you. And then accept this love. So let's do that. Sit comfortably. And then no rush, you know. You don't need to have a whole room of crowded. You know, if it is just one, and generally you can think of one is enough. But if you are so good at, you know, remembering all, then no room is, you know, too small, or no room is too big. It will contain all of them. So bring as many of these individuals, known and unknown, into our space. Then you can include, of course, spiritual teachers, teachers in grade school, doctors, nurses. Perhaps you have been in an accident, the EMT. I mean, literally, you would not be alive today. None of us would be alive today if we did not have these people in our lives. How much more love do we need? It's not that we don't have enough. It's we have not taken stock of. We have not recognized. So, first step of metta practice is to now relive all of that happening. So we'll do a few minutes of this, but take your time. No need to bring everyone yet. remember that in thinking of these individuals and bringing them into your presence, they do not have to be perfect. But just remembering all those instances that you recognize that they have shown or radiated to you metta. And connecting to those moments of being the recipient of metta, of loving kindness, of goodwill, with no expectations, no conditions, given freely. And now you relive and accept them. Relive those moments and bask in this radiance of metta. In receiving metta, in receiving goodwill and love and kindness, feel the security that you feel the safety and the ease that you feel yourself relaxing into that security, into that warmth, into that ease, into the letting down of your defenses, into your letting go of judgments of yourself. Feel the lightness and the ease that comes from that as you are being surrounded by metta. That's just a very short 10 minutes. You don't need to do very long. Of course, as you do more, you might want to do longer. Because as you start to recognize more and more of those instances, whether from long time ago or from more recently, then you can stay longer in this. Any observations that you want to share? Yes?
I was surprised. I saw my brothers. I had complicated, of course, like every family, complicated relationships with my brothers. I was really moved by how much love they had for me. It's something I hadn't recognized before. It was very deep, wide love that I don't think I had recognized before.
Yeah. It's interesting how, like, you know, without you, and with this, don't try to go to difficult situations, but sometimes they just pop up, and instead of the difficulty, the moments where you had recognized that this is metta, that care that they have for you, that comes up, then you suddenly recognize that yes, complicated, but there's also that side. But then when we're in conflict with someone, we tend to ignore all the other sides of that person, or the persons. Yes?
A lot of the ones I remember are dead.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that it's amazing to me how love persists.
Right.
It's really,
Right.
the thing I still have about some of these people is
Yes.
just the way they looked at me.
Right.
It's amazing. It makes me want to look that way at everyone I know.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Last.
And then, yeah, think of how
It will last.
when we are gone, right?
Yeah.
That continues when you have shown that to others genuinely. That we know will live on. Yeah. As Buddhists, we might believe in past, future life. I don't know. I take it as a belief because I see the skill in believing that way. But this, you know, because it just happened for you. Yes.
I didn't realize how many people like in my life showed that they cared, you know, until I said it.
How crowded the room got.
Yes.
Right.
In ways great and small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think this practice was the first time that my heart, mind, body, and soul smiled.
Uh-huh.
Just a little, without forcing, without
Right.
trying,
Right.
just knowing
Right.
and recognizing that love that I've had, that people have given me.
Yeah.
It's just a very subtle smile.
Yeah.
It's good.
Everything in society right now is conspiring to tell us how much people owe us and how much they have not, you know, met their end of the deal. And we're so bitter. And if we have gotten over the bitterness, we just have gotten cold. You might not be bitter, but you're like very jaded. It's because we're always being reminded how we've been taken advantage of, we've not been given a deal, we have been shorted, all of that. You know? Yeah, not to say that there aren't certain, you know, situations where you have to not let people do that to you, but we get consumed by that. Yeah.
When I was living in Austin, Texas, I was at a 7-Eleven,
Uh-huh.
and there was this drunk, and he came up to me and he said, got in my face, and he said, "Don't you ever let anybody tell you you're not beautiful."
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I thought of that.
Yeah.
We're so silly.
That kindness turned up. Yeah.
So silly.
Yeah. But there are so many moments like that we forget, like there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of metta that we're just not recognizing, and so then it's unavailable to us. Yes?
I would just say that receiving some of that is also painful. A little bit for me. That's my experience, It's, maybe it doesn't because it's all complicated.
Well, that's why here, so once you know that, you want to release that. You don't want to go into that, because again, now you're training a particular muscle. Okay? And then you just let that particular maybe person fade. Because then maybe guilt comes in, oh, I did not, and then, like, okay, quiet that down. Puppies.
Yeah.
Unless you're like, oh man, I kicked that puppy. So you want to dwell on like this basking in that, and just and then there is that side of us where we still say, but I don't deserve. But let that. I say, come later, we can talk. Not right now.
There's no more. Well, Anna Cox used to talk to us about all the people who've gotten up every day and made the Bodhisattva pledge for all sentient beings.
Right.
But they were doing that
For us.
Yeah, and I think about that all the time.
Right.
Millions of people,
Right.
countless people. And they really were doing everything they were doing.
Right. Yeah.
For us.
So you see all these images of like beauty photos of Tibetan grandmothers turning their prayer wheel. They're doing that for me, for you. Everyone that has ever dedicated their practice has dedicated that to your happiness. To your happiness. Yes?
Do you think, I'm thinking about art.
Uh-huh.
It may be painting or photography.
Uh-huh.
And we sometimes respond to art with love,
Uh-huh.
or recognize the love that's expressed in it.
Uh-huh.
Does art love us back?
I mean, just kind of, without getting too complicated, the answer is no. Because we want to train this with beings. So, now, it could be that a child is looking at a flower and the child smiles. Yeah? But that's not really the feeling, but me remembering seeing how happy the child is smiling at a flower, that is metta. I mean, if we want to get very technical.
What about nature?
Same, like flower, child watching. And it's metta is that feeling being expressed for another being. Like, oh, may you be happy, may you be well. Having said that, I'm not going to say, no, absolutely not possible. Maybe it's possible, but the examples used are always with sentient beings, with people especially. And in that sense, it's very important that we start with, yeah, you should be concerned about the feelings of your dog, but then if you only do that and forget about the feelings of human beings around you, and so sometimes that can get dangerous. People, it's like, I love my pets, I can't stand my family. You know? I mean, it's normal, but then we cannot remain like that. Yeah, then you're just, you know, where kindness is greatest is actually family. Part of, I mean, I know, right, this is probably getting into dangerous territory, you know, like, in part you love, you know, your pets so much because they don't talk back. You know, and we can project whatever we want to project onto them. It's very convenient, you know. And not to say you should not love your pets, you know, but kind of like need to kind of be clear about. But if the image that immediately evokes that feeling is your pet, then you have to start it. Then you begin to recall primarily the people in your lives that have shown you that. Then people you don't know. Then people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You know, it's not like he needs you to smile at him, but you recognize that kind of love, that kind of care. That he's radiating. You know, Mother Teresa's care. You know, of course, it's also complicated. You know, from another perspective. You know, people talk about how she glorifies poverty. You know, not solving poverty. Okay, all that issues. You know, we'll leave that aside first. Why can't we just recognize that there's a genuine love and care? How effective that love and care, that's a different conversation for a different context. Yes?
Some of the things that came up for me were situations where I could get upset and the kindness that people showed me that so touched my heart. Is that meta or detached?
Say a little bit more.
Well, a difficult time for me and how people came to me and just were so kind and helpful.
Oh, that part is metta.
That's meta?
Yeah, that part is metta. That their kindness part is metta. Yes. Yes.
So how do you practice metta for people that are close to you, that are not out for your greater good, that are out to harm you?
That's the next step.
Okay.
First, you need to recharge your own. You need to have a font of metta. You need to feel all the metta that you have ever felt and bring them all together. And do that first for a while before you radiate metta to others. And even in radiating metta to others, they say radiate that to those whom you have a fondness for. So the very same people that you have recognized their metta, and you radiate that back to them. Then you go further out, and those who want to harm you. And those who want to harm you, there is some understandings which we are going to look at. Yeah. And we think, you know, why do they want to harm me? Is that innate to them? Or what is going on? That can help a little. I'm not going to say that will completely convince you, but it introduces the wisdom perspective. A quick break. It's almost 5, but we can take like 7 minutes break.
Yeah.
Go. Yeah. I know. Metta transcends time.